Hey, it's Nana Plays Games, aka NPG. Today we're going to be testing the waters of a new type of video format I've been wanting to try. I was going to do this in the new year, but exams were kicking my ass and the original video I was supposed to have for today would have burnt me out. Anyway, here's a question I've been asking myself for a few years. Why are so many of the 2D Sonic bosses bad? Now I'm going to preface this by saying that there's always nuance. There are 2D Sonic games with wonderful bosses, and not every boss in every 2D title I'm about to talk about is terrible. But I've uncovered a really awful pattern as of late. You go back and replay 2D Sonic games as much as I do, you start to notice things. Many of the bosses are either A, too easy, B, too long, C, aren't creative, or D, are boring. This video is supposed to start a conversation and analyze the bosses a bit, so I hope it's insightful. So with that being said, let's get started. Let's start off with this. What is a good boss? Let's look at some 2D games and try to find an answer. Sonic Rush Adventure, for example, had some bosses that were pretty great for the most part. They were really a true example for what other 2D Sonic bosses should strive to be. The bosses had health bars, and though some were scripted to take a specific amount of hits to go down, it was usually up to you how you beat them. Many bosses had you get creative with the objects in the environment, or gave you the wiggle room to do as you pleased. A good boss gives the player a challenge, sure, but the challenge should be fair, well optimized, and fun. Other 2D games such as Superstars had a bit of a problem making bosses worth the effort. If the bosses aren't super easy, they take too long and often leave you wanting to rip your hair out. It's hilarious how bosses will sometimes take longer than the actual stages themselves, and of course it adds insult to injury if you die. All of Fang's bosses, for example, aren't fun in the least. Instead of being able to move around without fear of being instantly killed with no warning, you're forced to play at the game's pace and sweat your balls off till you make an understandable mistake. I don't think I have to explain to anyone that I hate auto-scrollers and think they're lazy as hell. It doesn't make it any better that the bosses in this game can't be cheesed and have instability frames while you often get crushed or fall to your death. If the bosses aren't going to be fun, the least they can do is let you blow right through them. Even so, Superstars isn't the odd one out in terms of wasting the player's time though. Rush's bosses seem to be even more keen on keeping a boss just far enough out of reach that you can't damage them when you feel like it. Sure, this approach could work, but not in the way it's designed here. Instead of making it so that you can't attack at certain intervals of the boss, you can't attack again after hitting it once. The boss has to allow you to attack it. Not because you're outmaneuvering its attacks or manipulating a clever blind spot, but because it'll do something stupid and you'll exploit that because it's your only option. It makes it even worse since the bosses have attacks that insta-kill. In a typical Sonic fashion, it takes 8 hits to take it down. Wait, attack, wait some more, attack again, potentially get insta-killed, yay. Yeah, the title says Rush, so I hope you didn't feel clickbaited when you get to the bosses. And I don't think I even have to mention how Advance 2 instantly kills you just by getting touched by this hand. To be honest, this is more funny than it was frustrating, but still. Even so, most of the quote-unquote bad bosses you'll see in the Advanced Trilogy are going to be in the first game. The bosses don't last long and take almost no effort to beat, not to mention how uncreative they are. A boss that just has you kind of sitting there waiting for it to be over can be just as frustrating as desperately trying not to die. A lot of the bosses, just like in Advance 1, end up being quite boring to play through. Sometimes the concepts are really unique, but the execution is what ends up being the problem. Even the classic Sonic games have issues with their bosses, and though they're not as frustrating, they're just as disappointing. And to be honest, they share some similarities with the other 2D games in terms of inconveniences. In short, they're wildly inconsistent. There are sometimes bosses between zones that up the difficulty spike by quite a lot, a shocking amount really. Sometimes you'll find a boss that goes down easy, then you have another boss that has the potential to insta-kill, then a boss that basically kills itself, and then another boss that just has you kind of sitting there for a huge portion of the fight. I understand that 2D games have more limitations when it comes to boss fights, especially if the games are older, but sometimes it just feels like they run out of ideas, especially with there being a boss in every act for Sonic 3 and Knuckles. So, I would say that a lot of 2D Sonic bosses are bad because they experiment too much or not enough. Trying new things, such as how to defeat a boss or how a boss reacts to damage, isn't a bad thing, but needs to be implemented well. Keeping things the same and not straying from a particular path isn't much better, as it can make the game feel stale and uninspired. I mean, there's only so much fun you can have with Sonic 2's bosses. And of course, I can imagine the expectations for 2D bosses were quite different a long time ago, you know, when most of these games were released. A lot of people probably didn't even see a problem with these bosses, especially since video games were still kinda new. I myself even felt pretty indifferent with these bosses when I first played them. Even so, we're in a new decade, about to go into a new year, and my expectations as well as other people's have changed. But I do have to say, making good bosses in a 2D game is not an easy task. You have more limitations than you would with a 3D game, it can be hard to get your creative juices flowing, and some ideas are really difficult to execute. Even then, like I said, bosses should be the following: fair, well optimized, and fun. The 2D games may fall flat in that regard, but there's still so much more to enjoy despite that. Still so many good concepts behind badly designed bosses, and while it's disappointing, there's always a lesson to be learned from past blunders. A lot of 2D games have issues with their bosses, whether that be how they're designed or how they're executed. Sometimes it's easy to ignore, other times it's not, and that's why we should have these conversations. It's important to criticize something you love so that it continues to get better, because honestly, it bums me out being so harsh about games I otherwise really adore. I can't deny that it's essential to pick things apart and see how it can be better though. So let's finish off on a good note. I love 2D Sonic games. I actually prefer them to 3D. If you ask me what my favorite games of all time are, Sonic 2, 3, and Rush would definitely be up there. They may not be the greatest boss-wise, but everyone deserves to love things that aren't perfect. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe. Ugh, I hate plugging, but if you want, donate to my coffee. This is MPG. Peace out.